Hi, we're Chelsea and Tony, and welcome to episode 2 of our podcast, Picture This.
Today we're talking about photography trends and fads, really fads. So we're going to cover everything from photographing dead people to those awful, like, floating head, double exposure portraits of the 80s, glamour shots, selfies.
But first, this episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to create a beautiful website, blog, online store, or, as we like to recommend, photography portfolio. Squarespace features an elegant interface, beautiful templates, and incredible 24/7 customer support. So you can try Squarespace at squarespace.com/Tony. You can do a 14-day trial, no credit card needed. If you like it, use the coupon code portfolio. You can get 10% off. Thank you for making this podcast possible, Squarespace.
Thanks, Squarespace. So what's the first photography fad that you found, Chelsea?
Well, the first significant one that I feel bad calling it a fad because it's pretty dark. Post-mortem photography. You know, it was inspired by 17th century paintings. They would often paint pictures of nobility once they had passed away, but that was expensive and not that common. And then once photography became more popular and they were taking pictures on daguerreotypes and it was more accessible, people were taking pictures of their dead relatives. And it's because most people didn't have pictures of themselves. So if your loved one passed away, especially a child or an infant, you wanted to document them. You wanted to be able to remember what they looked like. So people would hire a photographer to come, and they would sometimes they would prop them up to look lifelike. I saw a lot of pictures of the adults and they looked lifelike, which is very scary.
Oh, that must have been such a weird process for the photographer.
Oh gosh.
Every portrait photographer has creepy stories.
I've had bad gigs, but
propping up a dead guy, Weekend at Bernie's style.
Weekend at Bernie's photography.
Oh,
that'd be a good.
Did they have embalming and stuff at the time, at least?
No. Embalming wasn't widely used until after Abraham Lincoln died, because they were parading him around the country and they needed to keep his body fresh for everyone to see.
I can't believe you had such a detailed answer ready for that.
I know. I watched a video on that. But anyway, so they would prop up their loved ones, or they would, pose them like they were sleeping, and they would put flowers around them and they would get their picture. It was pretty expensive. I found one record of it being $75, and that's, in the 19th century, or towards the early part of the 19th century. I don't know what that would be with inflation, but that
could be $78, $79.
I'm guessing that,
Could be more. I don't know.
It'd be more than that. But then towards the end of the 19th century, as photography became more accessible and more popular, that practice wasn't done as much because they already had
and also because
I can only talked about it. They were like, "What was it like for you?" And we're like, "Don't do it. Don't do it."
I imagine it was easier too, because at the time you needed a really long exposure to get your film exposed properly. So you had to keep the shutter open for sometimes like 20, 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Or you had to do the thing that they did in those Westerns where they'd have the flash powder on a big platform and they'd like fire it and it would go poof. But
so you're saying in some ways it was an easy gig.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least they weren't wiggling around.
Yeah, they're like, this is great. I know that some people still do this, especially in other cultures. Sometimes people take pictures at funerals, but not common in our culture. What did you find? Maybe something a little lighter?
Yeah, well, I really didn't find much up until we got through to the 80s. Part of it is because for a fad to take off, you kind of need, it needs to be easy, it needs to be cheap, but it also needs to be communicative. You need to be able to share it from one person to another, because other people have to see what you're doing and do it themselves. And photography wasn't all that popular. It probably wasn't popular enough to spawn a lot of fads.
It was expensive. I mean, the daguerreotypes are a piece of copper, and then they have silver over them, polished silver. Those are expensive metals.
Yeah. Anyway, so starting in the late 70s and early 80s, we started to see this, what looks like now just an appalling portrait fad of the inset portrait with the floating head, always on a black background.
I love it.
Yeah, and when you search, no generation, no decade has a typical portrait. If you look for 30s portraits, 40s portraits, they all look the same. 70s portraits look the same.
Very still.
Yeah.
Just because of the way.
Just like, yeah, shoulders square or turned, head square or tilted a little bit. Pretty much head and shoulders. And then you get to 80s portraits. Just Google it. and suddenly everything changes.
Well, the 80s were a wild time.
It was. And there's some historical context here, and I'm taking this one because I lived through this.
I lived through it.
Well, you were so old at the time that you might not even remember it, but
well, you know.
This was during my teen years, so this is the most memorable part of many people's lives. I remember it distinctly, but the U.S. had been in this terrible economy for 20 years, more than that even, landing in the late 70s when things started to finally kind of turn around. So in the 80s, people have some disposable income finally, and things are getting better and better. And in fact, you start to see things like glam rock and big hair and bright colors.
Yes.
Things are getting awesome. People like to show off a little bit. And this trend, I think that helped to launch this trend. Some disposable income and the need to kind of show off.
You have yuppies.
The term yuppie,
You
yeah.
have pastel sweaters tied around your shoulders.
Yeah.
I mean, things were rich, people. This was a rich time.
If dads don't like their daughter's boyfriend, they say things like, they pull out their checkbook.
How much are going to have to pay you to walk away?
This is pretty much all you have to know about the 80s.
Yes, that's the 80s.
Kids.
Wow, we're good at that.
So
what's happening with the photography? What are these rich folk doing with their cameras?
Let's back up. Let's give some historical context. 1930s. A dude named Olan Mills. You might know the name.
I know Olan.
Starts up with his wife, taking some pictures. Builds his own studio pretty soon, and he's taking portraits. And they get the novel idea to kind of franchise it out. To not a franchise, they privately own it, but they start studios in different places and they manage it. They train photographers, often for hours at a time. They got so big so quickly that they didn't develop artisans. They didn't put people through 4 years of college to learn all the intricacies of photography. These are almost unskilled people. They would learn on the job over a day or two, or maybe a week. But pretty much being a photographer at one of these studios required keep the lights in these places, follow this very specific routine.
Make that head float.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's important because nowadays we have very creative portrait photography, and photographers spend years and years and years
mastering it. That's up for debate. Okay.
But at the time, literally, you needed to be able to give these people a couple of days training.
Yeah.
So one of the more creative techniques that came out of it was this double exposure thing. And I dug up a few people who had been photographers, and nobody could agree either on what it was called or how they did it. Some people called it inset photography. Some people called it composite photography, double exposure photography. It's all kind of the same process. Some people said that they did it by actually taking 2 exposures on a single negative. Some people did 2 exposures on a single negative, but they used a sort of a filter in the bellows of the camera that would block out part of the frame, and then it would rotate and expose another part of the frame in the second exposure. And other people would actually take 2 separate negatives and then put them in a special holder, stacking them one on top of the other for the printing process. So people had different techniques. We didn't all follow the same process, but they were kind of creating the same results, because once one studio saw this result of the double exposure and saw that it was popular, they would figure out a way to do it, but they wouldn't necessarily follow the same process. So
people saw those floating heads and they were just like, damn, I gotta get me that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you're not familiar with film photography, a double exposure is taking 2 pictures on a single frame. And if you were just to take 2 pictures, you would see like a ghostly image. You'd see like 2 copies of the same head kind of stacked one on top of each other. So the way you get around that is you make most of the picture black. And to get the floating head photography, you would also recompose the camera so that you'd have 1 copy of the face in the lower left corner and the other copy in the upper right corner, and everything else in the frame would have to be black. So sometimes they would end up putting like a black cape over the model so that their clothes and shirt, you know, their Garanimals shirt or their Transformer shirt or whatever, would be blacked out and wouldn't appear in the frame. And of course, they'd have to kind of control the lighting. So, you know, Olan Mills had a long history, and I feel terrible even associating their name with it because they were a popular studio for, 70 years. Like, they were one of the biggest names in photography ever. They had lots of kind of novel inventions, both to the process of photography and the technology. You know, their use of speed lights and even specific camera technologies was really innovative. Their use of telemarketing to build audiences.
Yeah, they were extremely successful business people.
And a family business, too.
Yeah, even successful in passing it on to the second generation, which is a very difficult move if you've studied business.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a shame that when we say Olan Mills now, all we think of are these awful double exposures. But they were popular for a very short period of time. And then we see them kind of mocked relentlessly nowadays. We've even made our own double exposures prior to this podcast.
That's because I think they're great.
They
hilarious.
Are so hilarious
Yeah.
because of the cheesiness of it. Part of it is also brought on by that necessary low-key lighting, the fact that you need a black background and the fact that black denotes heavy drama.
Yeah.
They might have liked it better with a white background. It just wasn't technically feasible since they were shooting on negatives and doing this very like film-oriented process. So that necessitated the really goofy-looking drama. The double exposure portrait, it came and it mercifully went fairly quickly. It will never be forgotten. Olan Mills will never be forgotten either. Olan Mills.
Actually, it has evolved because double exposures became popular once again in the past few years. It was the, what's the show? True Detective.
Oh, right. The intro of True Detective.
The intro was all shot in double exposure. But instead of having two heads, you're overlaying a head with often trees. And I'm sure our viewers have all seen that picture. Everyone has it. I have one of Siobhan with flowers. And it's novel and it's cool at first, and then it becomes cliche and the same ideas keep getting repeated. And so it came and went again pretty fast.
When you said True Detective and double exposure, at first I was still thinking Olan Mills. So I imagined like Woody Harrelson looking directly at the camera and then like Matthew McConaughey in the corner looking off into the distance.
Yeah. No. But we take the same idea and we've added a new spin to it, and then we just killed it by just doing the same thing over and over again. And that's probably what happened with Olan Mills' fad as well.
Yeah. Well, JCPenney, Kmart, and then I think JCPenney bought the Olan Mills name, and now most portrait studios are long forgotten and gone because now people just take their own pictures or they use a smaller portrait.
Now we have our own terrible fads that will hopefully die one day.
Before we completely leave the 80s, let's move on to 1988.
I love 1988.
What do you love about it?
Oh, it was a good year for me. I was just retiring, which was good.
1988, the portrait studio Glamour Shots was founded.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like Kleenex, because now we say Glamour Shots, we mean it generically. But this was an actual company.
That was the name
Glamour
of the
Shots,
company.
And they made portrait studios in malls, catering to younger and older women to make women feel beautiful. To take the pictures that you could only get in magazines. And that meant lots of things. That meant giving them a wardrobe, gussing up their hair.
Boa, feather boa.
Oh, yeah.
You can't be glamorous without that.
Makeup. So there'd be a makeup artist, a hairdresser.
A lot of Aquanet, I'm sure.
Oh, especially when I was growing up in Texas.
Yeah.
Oh, Pflugerville, Texas. You can bet they would break those bangs out. I don't know. Maybe they even brought in some artificial bangs.
That's probably why we have global warming today. Just Aquanet in Texas.
It was probably a problem.
Yeah.
And so they'd do all this stuff to them. They'd cake on the makeup. And
yes, you do.
I think they would put something on the lens. They must have like put that like Barbara Walters filter on the lens.
Yeah, the Oprah filter.
Some lenses like the 135 f2s will have
soft
like a
round.
soft focus feature where you get that like haze.
Yeah.
And then they had several signature poses. So there was the like curved hand under the chin,
which is my go-to.
Yeah. Sometimes it would be on the face. Often they'd grab the collar of their sequined jacket provided by
a very like punky
Glamour
Brewster.
Shots. Yeah, and they go like this.
You're good at that. Punky.
I think this was the first time we saw the like shoulders away from the camera and then looking back and like looking like.
Dang, you are nailing that.
Yeah.
For all of you listening to the audio version of our podcast, Tony has been practicing these poses maybe a little too much.
Since 1988. It's always been my dream to have a glamour shot taken. It was never socially acceptable for men to go there, though.
We can do that. I had a sister that had a glamour shot taken, And even at the time, I thought it was hilarious.
It's such a coincidence. I literally stumbled across this picture in your grandparents' house yesterday in a very 80s frame, sitting, you know, how grandparents have all the pictures. I just happened to spot this. I'm like, oh my God, that's Chelsea's sister.
I know. All right, so let me just introduce you. So on the line, we have my sister, Melissa, and she was gracious enough to volunteer her glamour picture.
It was a 16th birthday gift from our mother, and I brought my best friend at the time with me, and we did it together. And it had an older gentleman that did our hair and makeup.
Oh.
And you would pick out the color satin scarf that you wanted for them to drape around you to make it look like a dress.
Oh, so you're not actually wearing a dress. They just put that around you.
They just put that around you. They gave you a very fashion-forward tube top to put on, and then they would wrap you in whatever fabric you picked.
So there was only one guy manning this whole operation.
There was.
Wow, and he took the picture too.
He did, and he was very stellar with the rouge.
Oh, yeah, because he did your makeup. So was this like something that all of the girls were doing and getting done, or what inspired this?
We used to hang out at the mall, and I saw that they had that in the mall, and I was telling Mom about it, and she thought that it would be a good idea to do it for my birthday.
But it is something that you wanted.
Oh, yes, I wanted it. I wanted to look, you know, glamorous.
Yeah, because we were saying at this time it wasn't easy to get a picture where you looked like someone in the magazine, so it makes sense that this would be really appealing. Yes,
and there wasn't any photo retouching or anything like that.
Oh, they didn't do retouching? Oh.
No, that's all me, honey.
You look really sad in the picture.
I remember being very uncomfortable because he kept adjusting the top of the fabric, like tucking it in the front and like folding it, which was really awkward for a 16-year-old girl to have some guy touching you and like rearranging you.
You're yelling stranger danger. It's the opposite of glamour.
Did you have to tip the guy, or just fondling you tip enough?
I think that was tip enough.
Okay, that's generous.
But like, what is the thought process? You get all like gussied up with your bright red lipstick and then you give it to Nana. What's Nana supposed to think? They're like, thank you, you little hussy. Thank you.
We're talking to Tammy Smith, one of our readers. So about what year did you go to Glamour Shots?
You know, I would say I was probably a freshman in high school, which would have been 89 or 90. And it was a very, at that time, very glamorous experience. They took you in, they did your makeup, you know, heavier than probably had ever been done. Big, huge hair was in then. And,
oh, yeah.
And so they did your hair and they put you in these, you know, low cut, seductive outfits and made you feel all beautiful and sexy.
Is that weird for a 13 or 14-year-old?
I guess I don't think it was too weird at the time. I mean, I don't think it was weird for me. Like now that I look back at the pictures, I'm like, whoa, those were probably not appropriate for a 13-year-old.
Yeah.
But at the time, like, I don't know, it felt cool at the time, I guess.
And everybody was doing it too. So it was normal. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, your mom was there.
Had someone separate for your hair and then someone separate for your makeup. And then you went in this other room and they put like these glittery drapes around you or taffeta drapes around you and long gloves. And then, took your picture.
And did you bring your own boa and white gloves, or did they provide that?
I did not. That was all them. I didn't own too many boas back then.
I didn't expect you to.
She just had it laying around, just something that we had.
Closet. Yeah, they provided all of that. I mean, looking back, they look really tacky. But back then, I mean, it was the style, big hair. I mean, I remember curling my hair that way every morning to go to school. So big hair and
yours are not bad. You don't even have the bangs that were in fashion. Like that time we had these big bangs that curled over.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. And we were talking about how this was popular. This was normal then. There's so many trends now that we'll look back at and we'll say, what on earth were we thinking?
Oh, this is no worse than duckface.
Oh, this
slightly more expensive, but no less embarrassing. Well, thanks for talking to us, Tammy. We'll let you get back to your day.
Thank you, guys. See you later.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Glamour Shots at its peak had more than 900 of these stores throughout the country. But then there were lots of copycats everywhere too.
So many sexy girls.
So basically, every mall had one of these things. And as of my own firsthand account, I graduated high school from Pflugerville, Texas in 1992. And so many of the girls graduating that year would get their senior shots done at the mall's Glamour Shots. And they were, even at the time, it was appalling. It was so silly. Like now we look at glamour shots and we think they're ridiculous, but
They were ridiculous at the time.
Yeah, at the time, it would be too expensive to get a picture for everybody. So you'd get like one 8x10 and bring it to science class and show everybody.
Everybody look at me. I was hot for 20 minutes on Tuesday.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, your acne was briefly cleared up there. I've never seen you wear a boa to class.
It's a good look for you.
It's a boa and a sequin shirt. You're looking fine in that picture.
What are you doing next week?
We do this now. Like you people trick other people into thinking they look better than they do by putting only glamorized pictures of themselves on Facebook.
I'm doing it right now.
Or MySpace or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's really ridiculous when you have to hold the picture in front of your actual less attractive self. Like, it's not fooling anybody. And then apparently you'd send them off to your grandparents in a teal frame.
Yeah. This is what Becky would look like if she were attractive.
Yeah. Thanks for the oily skin, DNA, Grandma.
Am I alone in thinking that would be a really fun gig? Just getting these awkward teenage girls and wrapping them in feather boas and over-the-top makeup. I think that would be fun from the photographer's point of view. Maybe a little soul-sucking after a while, but certainly fun at first.
Yeah, well, I looked up reviews from employees of Glamour Shots because Glamour Shots is still around. They're still doing basically the same thing. It's the theme is the same. They want to make people feel beautiful. It doesn't look so 80s/90s.
Yeah.
But they're still doing it. And the number one thing they say is that the hardest part they have is overcoming the stigma that they got from these pictures in the 80s and 90s. Because sometimes you just never escape these things.
Yeah, well, your name is Glamour Shots. How are you going to run away from that? We all think of something very specific when somebody says Glamour Shots.
But overall, they don't report that it's much fun. It doesn't seem like it's much fun.
I would probably get repetitive after a while. But come on, it can't be any worse than our trends now. You know, people just put a kid in a basket on a fake backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
They do a mini session or something. They basically take the same picture of 15 kids. That's not fun either. At least you would get to put makeup on the baby. Baby glamour shots, maybe a fad for the future.
No, this doesn't feel right. I'd rather photograph dead people.
This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to create a beautiful website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas. Squarespace features an elegant interface, beautiful templates, and incredible 24/7 customer support. So try Squarespace at squarespace.com/Tony. 14-day free trial, no credit card needed. If you decide that you like it, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code PORTFOLIO.
You don't have to be a pro photographer to use Squarespace. You just have to be somebody who wants their pictures to look awesome, who wants something, better than putting them on Facebook or Twitter, like a permanent place to show off your very best
It's
pictures.
A good exercise too. Forces you to think about the pictures that you have, the pictures that you need more of.
Yeah, we tell people to do this, to go to squarespace.com/Tony and get their 14-day free trial, and then go through the exercise of picking your 10 to 15, that's it, 10 to 15 best pictures that you've ever taken of your whole life, and put them on there. Organize them in a way that they flow with lots of variety. Put them in order, say start with your best picture, end with your second best picture, and then just mix them up in between. And it's a fantastic exercise that will improve your photography. And once you do that, every time you go out to take a picture, you're thinking, how can I get a picture on my portfolio? And to do that, you have to beat your high score. You basically have to take a picture better than the worst picture in your portfolio. So you're always trying to outdo yourself.
Yeah.
You're competing against yourself. And it all starts when you have an actual portfolio. So Squarespace, our sponsor, you can sign up for free at squarespace.com/Tony. And then if you decide to sign up, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code PORTFOLIO. Thank you, Squarespace. Let's fast forward just a little bit to May of 1995. And Steve Mann and R.W. Picard publish a paper that basically describes HDR.
Wow, that's much earlier than I would have guessed.
Right? HDR with digital images, because HDR, high dynamic range. Cameras can see like 8 or 9 stops of dynamic range, or a picture typically captures 8 or 9 stops of dynamic range. But your eye can see like 13, 14 stops. And that's why if you're outside and your friends are outside, and the sky is nice and bright with clouds and sun and stuff, you can see the clouds and the sky and your friend's face. When you take a picture of them, either the sky is solid white or their face is completely dark. It's because picture doesn't have the same dynamic range. So high dynamic range is a process of capturing the bright sky and clouds and the dark subject in the foreground and blending them together so it looks natural or unnatural, as the fad would come to be. And people have been doing this. They did this in the film era. They would take 2 pictures and they'd cut the sky out and overlay it.
I was just wondering if they did that, thinking that would be possible.
It was possible and people did it. But it wasn't really until 1995 that Steve Mann published this paper very precisely describing how to look at each individual picture. It would be bracketing multiple pictures. This is covered in Chapter 10 of Stunning Digital Photography, our book, if you're curious. But HDR is a pretty well-known phenomenon. So he basically said how to do it. Since then, Steve, he's still working on it. Like now he's working on designing a welding mask for welders. Because welding, the ultimate in dynamic range. You're working on like dark metal, but you're making like the brightest thing on the planet, basically.
I had never considered that would be a problem. So he's inventing a mask that has better dynamic range?
Yeah, right now you just pull down a mask and it's just like dark sunglasses. It just blocks all the light. So you can see your torch, but you can't necessarily see the metal. This mask will have a camera in it, which is doing like real-time HDR, showing you the detail of the metal that you're working on and the solder and such, as well as your torch. This is a nice practical example of HDR. But between his invention of it and that modern implementation of it, we've had some tough times with HDR.
Oh, do you mean maybe too much tone mapping?
Yeah, tone mapping. So I think most people probably know about the trend of HDR, but you get these very romantic looking pictures.
Oh, or gritty.
Or sometimes gritty.
A lot of haloing.
Yeah.
Any little flaw is magnified.
Throughout the 90s, just about every reference to HDR is extremely nerdy. And I mean nerdy in an affectionate way. Like you can look up on old news groups where people are discussing this kind of thing, and they're all just imaging nerds who are experimenting with this kind of thing. There was an app called HDR Soft, which would blend together multiple images, but you had to be very technical with it. And in the early to mid, like 2003, 2004, we started to see some more attainable apps and more like consumer adoption of HDR. They'd bracket their pictures in camera and blend them together. And in 2005, Adobe Photoshop, this was a landmark moment for HDR. Adobe Photoshop included HDR technology in the app for free in Adobe Photoshop CS2.
So just to take us back a little bit, HDR started in the darkroom, which I find funny because so many photo purists are always saying like, oh, digital ruined photography, you manipulate the photo too much. It started in the darkroom, and then we evolved it all the way to Photoshop 2005. That's pretty cool.
Right. But we still didn't get this HDR fad, which has the same name. So HDR has practical purposes like seeing the stuff when you're welding, as well as capturing images more realistically. Right. But then there's this fad that we've all grown to hate, which is it's like super oversaturated and way too much localized contrast.
It's polarizing. Some people hate it.
Yeah. We all kind of loved it for several years. Now the tide has turned and a lot of people see it and kind of cringe. It's so bad that I used to have HDR pictures in my portfolio, but I had to pull them out.
People bullied them right off of your portfolio.
They did. They would say things like, I used to like his photography until I saw his portfolio. I literally vomited when I saw those HDR photos. I still remember that particular quote. Somebody said they literally vomited.
Wow.
Person with a very weak constitution.
You know, I'm not a doctor, but I'd probably say those two events aren't related.
So around 2005 through 2009, we see the growth of the popularity of this sort of tone-mapped HDR, this artistic HDR, largely brought on by the popularity of software called Photomatix Pro, which, while Photoshop was only really capable of doing very realistic HDR rendering, Photomatix Pro had this like contrast slider built in, and by default it would up the contrast for you and do this localized tone mapping. It could also do the realistic stuff, but that's not really how a lot of people used it.
When you first discover something like that, you want to go all the way. It's why when people discover spot color, every picture is spot color for months. You know, it's just the way that it works.
So I went trying to figure out, when did this artistic HDR fad die?
Ooh.
And
did you look at Google Trends by any chance?
I did. And I see in Google Trends that it peaked in 2009 and it's just been at a steady decline since.
So let me ask you this. Do you feel like camera technology is taking away from that tone mapping fad? Because the dynamic range in your camera is getting better and better.
Maybe so. Because now we don't need to bracket our shots. We don't need Photomatix Pro. We can take a raw picture, recover the highlights, pull up the shadows, and get a very realistic looking image. But I also think it's just that we all got sick of people in that stage of learning. Like 6 months to 1 year after getting their first camera, they start to experiment with HDR, and then that's all they do for 3 months.
Yeah.
And we all got kind of sick of it because they were taking ugly or regular looking boring pictures and making them interesting only using software. And any photography purist kind of hates that. And so I think that's what kind of killed it. And nowadays, HDR searches are about 1/10 what they were in 2009. But looking at the tags on Flickr, we still see about 750,000 pictures tagged every year. So it did peak 2009, 2010 on Flickr, but it leveled off. So my theory is that once you get indoctrinated into HDR, many people continue to shoot that for years and years to come. But we're not indoctrinating as many new people.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still seeing the same volume of pictures, but not that many new people are getting into HDR, the artistic HDR.
Yeah.
We still teach it. It's still, there's a chapter dedicated to it in Stunning Digital Photography.
That's our book.
Right. More for the practical application than the artistic application. Though the early editions of SDP focused on making these sort of contrasty, oversaturated pictures, and the recent editions focus on just getting more realistic, lifelike results using those techniques.
It's funny because I was teaching a friend of ours photography, and she told me, I don't like HDR. And I pulled up my camera and I said, look at this. And I had in-camera HDR. I took 3 pictures. I showed her, and she said, wow, it's like plastic surgery. You don't know it's HDR unless it's bad HDR. And I said, yeah, it can be very practical. It can be very natural. So HDR is maybe here to stay unless cameras advance so much that you don't need it at all.
No, I think we still both sneak a couple of HDR pictures in our portfolio. They're just subtly done that people don't know.
So sneaky.
But you do have to kind of whisper about it.
Sneaky.
Anyway, now we're seeing HDR TVs, which is a little bit of it's not really the same thing. It's just adding more dynamic range. But we're still seeing that term. Selfies. The next fad to really come along.
Yeah. What do you suppose started the selfie? I guess just the portableness of your camera phone.
I traced it back to MySpace in 2005. Now, there were things like LiveJournal that predated MySpace, but MySpace kind of blew up.
Having that icon where you need a picture of yourself.
Right. And it was MySpace. It was a page that was just you.
Aww.
So what were you supposed to put there? Put pictures of yourself. Like, nowadays, Facebook isn't even that self-centered. But in MySpace, it was like, I like this music, I like this book, me, 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 me. And in 2005, well, they were actually calling them MySpace pics, just part of the vocabulary. And the term selfie doesn't come up until later, but they were selfies. And you're right. We started out with flip phones that had little terrible cameras in them, but we couldn't do much with them. But it was really the iPhone, the first iPhone released in 2007, and then the popularity of that I feel kind of launched the selfie to become the like massive art form that it is now.
Oh, and then when they put the camera in the front of the phone, that must have been when it really blew up.
So on June 7th, 2010, Apple released the iPhone 4, which had that front-facing camera. Because when you had the back-facing camera, you took selfies.
You tried to do it in the mirror.
Right. This is what happened first. You took bathroom pictures in the mirror, and everybody could see the type of dandruff shampoo that you used.
Or you zoomed in, and you were really blurry with some weird flash obscuring half your face.
Yeah. You could hold it out like this, but you'd miscompose because you couldn't see your framing.
Yeah.
So you'd cut your own head off or whatever. So we could hold the smartphone out on our hand and see ourselves in real time and kind of pose.
Adjust.
Try to get the right expression. Yep. Show a little cleavage just to let people know that
you're always showing cleavage.
Yeah. And we also see the duck face kind of come about. But we'll come back to the duck face. At this point, we still don't have the term selfie, though. They're MySpace pictures, or maybe they're even self-portraits. The term selfie doesn't really start to come around until 2013 or so. It enters the vocabulary in a very small way. And then
Wow.
At the end of January 2014, a band called the Chainsmokers releases an electronica song called #Selfie.
It's awful.
I liked the song, but I kind of like that genre of music. And it's a weird thing because it's clearly making fun of people who take these selfies. It's satirical, it's mocking them. But they reached out to the YouTube community and asked people to send in their own selfies. So thousands of people sent in their own selfies, including David Hasselhoff.
Ooh.
And the video itself, which has over 400 million views, has actual selfies from people. So people started to actually embrace this. Even though it was making fun of it, it actually grew. And this is often what kills a fad. It's what killed HDR. It's what killed Glamour Shots. It's what's killed the double exposures. Once you start making fun of it, it's not cool anymore.
I have not seen a decline in the selfie. Have you?
No. The selfie is a fad that has not ended, and I even wonder if it ever will end.
Do you think maybe people thought that about the floating heads, though? They were like, when will we escape these floating heads?
Yeah, I'm confident that we did. I don't remember. I remember thinking they were awesome. I don't remember thinking they were silly.
Like that. I see the selfie evolving, but it does seem like it's going to be a long-standing trend just because we're always showing pictures of ourselves on social media, and even sites like LinkedIn make it seem more valid instead of just completely narcissistic.
Mm-hmm. Dating websites.
Yeah.
Everybody needs a selfie. So a corollary to that is the selfie stick, which came about in 2015. This is a very recent fad.
A very shameful invention.
Yeah, because the front-facing cameras they have a focal length designed specifically to get a shot of yourself at arm's length. But it's too telephoto to really get a shot of you and your friends.
It's also not flattering.
Well, right, because it's so close up and wide angle, and that's why you have to develop things like duckface to make yourself look decent in a ridiculous picture. Every portrait photographer knows you're standing 6 to 8 feet away with a telephoto lens, and not 2 to 3 feet away, your arm's length, with a wide angle lens. So it's not a flattering perspective, but you can move the camera further away by getting a longer arm or getting a selfie stick. And these selfie sticks have become the bane of every tourist area, because everybody wants a picture of themselves.
It's like you don't even exist if you're not in the picture.
Yes, it's like you didn't actually visit that place unless there's a picture of you with it.
Mm-hmm.
So we've used them.
What?
Don't you remember with Erky and
Whose was that?
That was our selfie stick.
Oh, dun dun dun.
Yeah, they're commonly used for videography too, and we have used them. Casey Neistat uses a selfie stick all the time.
That's right.
A very popular YouTuber.
You put it at the end while you were riding your bike.
Right. When you see the pictures and the video taken with a selfie stick, you might not even think about it because they can be completely hidden out of the way. You don't see the hand and the stick.
Right.
They don't look that bad unless you see somebody actually using it in person. Then you think it looks ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that's why people hate selfie sticks. And also because you're holding this thing out of you and not paying attention to the world around you. You're bonking it into people. You're taking up 10 times more space than you need to. And it's just ridiculous looking. I don't think selfie sticks will go away until we get selfie drones.
I think we'll get arm extensions. Just putting it out there. Just putting it out there.
Like Mr. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Have you ever done the duck face?
No.
Never. You've never done a duck face?
No.
I have photographic proof right here that you're wrong.
Stop it.
I'm just joking.
I don't think I've ever done the duck face.
I would hope not.
But I also didn't think I'd ever use the selfie stick. Though in my defense, it sounds as though it was against my will.
Can you describe the duck face for people?
The duck face. I would say that the duck face is when you suck in your cheeks a little and pout your lips out. And I think that people are trying to make their faces look slimmer and their lips fuller. We've got this full lip trend. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants full lips. I can't even do it. I don't know what you're supposed to do. Is that right, Justin? It's something
close enough.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think people are looking at themselves while they're taking their selfies. They get to pose, they get to experiment. Everything's from a high angle. You want to stretch that chin, and then they realize, oh, I want my face to be thinner. I want my lips to look bigger. That's the duck face.
So we kind of saw the duck face pick up in popularity at the same time as the selfie, like starting in 2005 or so.
I got to say, I thought the duck face was terrible, but post-mortem pictures, they kind of take the cake. We don't want, if any of them were to come back, any of these trends, that would be the last one.
But the duck face is a fad that mocking it managed to kill. While mocking selfies has only seemed to make it more powerful, mocking duck face really did kind of kill it. So as we see the popularity of the term duck face increase, we see the number of duck face pictures drop dramatically. Okay. And now people know what it is and they're embarrassed by it.
I do have to say, there's an acceptable selfie. There is some fine line you walk when you take a selfie. Mm-hmm. Selfie in front of a monument, okay, you give the person a pass. Selfie just because you're in your car and you're documenting that, suddenly not acceptable. There seems to be this like fine line between acceptable selfie and unacceptable selfie. And the frequency as well. This is something we're documenting for our grandchildren.
Yeah, and I think there's also how much work are you putting into the expression and any sort of fakery or douchebaggery. Yeah. And that's why the duck face was such a sin, was because you were clearly trying really hard. It's the same problem that you had with Glamour Shots, is the person was trying really hard.
You were trying too hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you weren't fooling anybody, by the way.
How about the fake Candid selfie?
Oh, yeah, I hate that one too, where you can see that they're holding the camera and
yeah.
you're like, did you surprise yourself?
Oh, I'm just looking over here and accidentally took a selfie of myself.
They caught me slipping.
Tony, that was funny. So I would like to take a moment to predict the future trends. I mean, we started with the dead peeps. We had floating heads just because that's what technology allowed. HDR technology allowed it, and so we pushed it to the limits. The same thing with selfies. A lot of these were technology-driven trends. Mm-hmm. So what will technology make us do next that we will regret?
We mentioned selfie drones. I think drones will become smaller, quieter, and less expensive, more portable. We'll be able to pull it out of our pocket, set it a flight, and it will follow us. It will go in front of us. I think they'll even have little screens so we can properly pose ourselves, because you got to be able to make sure you're in the frame and such, and it'll be snapping photos and probably video of you.
I have to say, some things we didn't cover were the post-processing fads that we've seen, like a lot of solar flare. And that was a feature that came up in Photoshop, the fake lens flare.
Yeah.
And then people are putting it in all of their pictures, and you know it because there's only really one lens flare that looks like a camera lens flare in Photoshop, and everyone ends up reusing it. And also the fake colors in the background, like the sun pops or like the sunset colors. We're seeing so much of that now. The overly smooth airbrush skin, I see a lot of that now. These are all the things that are fads now that we're currently still in, and I think that we're going to look back at them and just be repulsed.
I agree. But I think we'll see a lot of those continue into video, because I have this prediction that selfies will take over still selfies, because, for example, now Facebook allows a little video clip to be used for your profile picture, and with bandwidth restrictions and display limitations removed, we're going to see the still pictures die off, replaced by video clips. But we're also seeing real-time processing of video clips. So now you can take a video clip of yourself and it will remove the zits from your skin in a video.
So you think that photography in general is going to die out and we're moving towards video?
Yeah, I think as a trend, there won't be much reason to do still photos in, 10 years, whatever it is. There'll be just as much creativity, maybe more. It'll just be moving pictures, multiple frames stacked together.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that already, especially with our daughter. She's 12. My niece is 13, and they're taking these short video clips of themselves. They're lip syncing over something, and then they're sharing it with their friends, just pretending to be acting.
Yep.
And it's interesting because they're in it. They're in their own little short movie.
They'll put their face on Donald Trump, for example. Not on a still photo, but on a video.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. You can record yourself in real time and see Donald Trump's face over your own face and body. It's amazing what we can do in real time as the sort of processing power increases. So I think we'll see a lot of cheesy video effects in the very near future.
I think so too. Well, we did ask our viewers what their least favorite trends were, and I heard things about feet in the foreground, spot color, solar flare. They told us a bunch of them. So maybe they'll also comment on the video or on the audio podcast and tell us what their favorite and least favorite fads, trends are, what they think will be popular in the future. One thing that I realized talking to Tammy and Sandy and Melissa and seeing their pictures is that they actually weren't that bad. And I think that when we see examples of glamour shots online, it's the worst of the worst.
Right. And Olan Mills shots weren't that bad.
Yeah.
It's just we remember it for the worst of the worst.
And it makes me think that looking back, when people are looking at the fads that we're engaging in now, they're going to see the worst examples of HDR. They're going to see the worst examples of our double exposures or our sun flare. So
can we say that the photographing dead people wasn't that bad?
I mean, it actually wasn't. I think that one's pretty relatable. I wouldn't want to do it, but
No?
it makes total sense.
Okay, I'll put that in your living will.
If there were no other pictures, then yeah, it makes total sense. But what if you did a mashup of the trends? HDR post-mortem glamour shot. Think it over.
I think we have our photo theme for the next week. Thanks for joining us. We should tell them about our sponsor, Squarespace.
Yes, Squarespace. We told you about them before, but they're a great web hosting site where you can make your own portfolio or blog or even your own store. They feature 24/7 customer support. And if you use squarespace.com/Tony, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code portfolio.
Squarespace is great for real photographers. This is not MySpace or Facebook or Twitter. This is if you want your actual pictures to look fantastic and beautiful. Chelsea and I both have Squarespace portfolios, so you can see an example of how they look at northropphotography.com and chelseanorthrop.com. Anyway, they just make it all look beautiful. They give you full analytics. This is not social networking photography. This is not for your selfie. These are for the pictures that you've
For your clients
spent
or
weeks
your
and
gallery
months
work. Yeah.
collecting to make yourself. Let people know of your actual skill level.
You can go to northrop.photo to see example pictures from this podcast or see our blog. You can also press subscribe if you're on YouTube and you'd like to see more videos like these. Thanks for watching.
Thanks.